Alright, so DOM 103, positioning and z-index. Right now, on this page, we got this box. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put another box. Now there's two things on the page. By default, it is position static. They are not affected by the top, bottom, left, and right properties. I'll give this one left, left. So this, since these are position static, that style does absolutely nothing. But position relative. And we'll give both of these position relative, actually. So position relative, that's just like bumping it to the left of where it would, where it would normally be on the page. Be like top negative 20 pixels, and it should overlap a little bit. It's position relative to its normal position.
Which is why it overlaps the red one.
Yeah. And so I'm going to get rid of the position relative right now because we're noticing that this one's overlapping this one. That's because we haven't specified z-index. We haven't specified a z-index on either of these. By default, the z-index, or like the default z-index, is just going to be like whatever is in the HTML last is.
Okay.
If I move this box up, if we made these position fixed, so yeah, so it's whichever one is last on the page is like has the highest by default if none is specified. Position relative. Okay, so position fixed is based on where it is in the window. Position relative is relative to its normal position. Well, here, I'll take the positioning off of the parent, and then I'm going to put box 2 inside of box 1, making it the parent. So box 1 is position static. Box 2, I'm going to give them little labels. We are going to make this one absolute. Okay, the only thing I ever use position relative for when it's not in the context of position absolute is if I have like some, I don't know, like a button or something, and I have text, and there's some sort of like icon in there, like a font awesome icon or something, and it's just not aligning properly. I might give that icon like position relative and bump it up or down 1 pixel to align it with the text properly. That's the only time. All right, so give this a top margin. Show what's up with this one. Okay, so you'll see no matter where this has moved around on the page, this box is still in the same place, and it's still negative 20 pixels up, and that's because position absolute elements, their positioning is based on their closest parent with position relative or position absolute, or I think position, yeah, their closest ancestor. I mean, their closest ancestor that has position absolute, position relative, or I think position fixed as well. Yeah, it is based on the closest ancestor that has a position set. And if none of its parents have a position set, defaults to like the HTML. So if I make this position relative, then you'll see it's positioned based on this.
Yeah, I do see that.
Get rid of this left, it should bump it all to the left. Yeah.
Nice.
And then yeah, if I just wrap this in a random div, you know what, I won't make this a random div, I'll make this box 3. Alright, so we've got box 3, and as you can see, it didn't change anything. Even if we move it around, because this is... Mike, do you want to take over while I stuff my face full of chocolates?
Sure. Alright, so we talked about like the mural, we talked about the empty frame moving around on top of the mural, which is the window, the viewport, and then we've talked about, yeah, the document, the DOM. So then we've talked about position static, which is the default. You should never need to set anything explicitly to that. Position relative is another one. This is like a hook, right? This is like making, if you have an element that you want to turn into something that you can position other elements relative to, then you use position relative. So that you can make it so that you can position other elements relative to this one. it's not about really positioning this element itself, it's about turning it into a hook. And then there's position absolute, which is like, use one of your hooks to position this element with like X and Y coordinates, basically. And then if you use position absolute, this rips the element out of the DOM, or like right out of the normal flow. It's still in the DOM, but it's out of like even if it was a display block element, it was taking up a whole line, right? Or it was, and if it was a display inline element, it was in the normal flow. But it was like there, like it was taking up space. It makes it not take up space anymore if you put position absolute. So its parent, much like when we floated elements, the parent, the containing their parent, lost its height, right? So it lost those elements that were floated stopped taking up space. There was a way around it with floated elements, but for position absolute elements, there ain't no way around it. So which is fine, because the time when you use position absolute probably the most is like when your other options don't work. So you don't want to pull your hair out trying to do float when you don't need it, but like, position absolute is more to deal with. In a lot of cases, you have to like write more code and maintain more code by using it, but it's kind of like your ultimate power. And if you have like a nav bar and you need to make sure that the logo is in the top left corner of the nav bar, like chances are you might use position absolute, or you might use float. Either one is fine, but like it's totally. I would say we use a combination of these things like all the time, basically. Okay, and then we've talked about position fixed, which is position relative to the window, to the viewport. So here's the thing about z-index. Okay, cool. All right, so we have this green position static thing. Yeah.
Do we need to cover sticky or not? Position sticky?
It looks like this got added in 2017. Okay, so there's still some vendor prefixing going on with it, looks like. Not supported in IE 11, so we should not be using it on any of our projects right now. Let's at least like wrap our heads around it real quick. The element is positioned according to the normal flow of the document, and then offset relative to its nearest scrolling ancestor. Its nearest scrolling ancestor, and containing block, nearest block level ancestor. This is for like if you have like, if you have many scroll bars, or like if you have like, so we haven't really talked about much of this yet, because honestly no one does this. No one really has like little scroll bars on the page anymore. But it seems like this is like the equivalent of position fixed, but instead of for the viewport, it's like for the little micro viewport little guy. You got an orange box and a brown box. So the orange box is containing the brown box, and they're both position static. The orange box is real full of stuff. Okay. So if I was to give the orange box a fixed height, so like right now by default, like it is just spilling out of the box. So whenever we have content, let's look at the size of our box. We know it's going to be 50 pixels. Well, it's going to be 50 pixels high on the insides anyways. Okay, and then we've got another brown box, and it's kind of spilling out, and then we've got even more like overstuffed stuff spilling out. So that's what's happening by default. Let's go ahead and make a selector for box 4, and let's make a selector for box 5, and let's give box 4, let's pull its dimension characteristics out here just so we can see it nicely written out. So we're going to give it height 50 pixels, and then and we'll even, we'll make box 5 even taller, not that this matters, but just so that we can really overstuff. Okay, so what is the overflow property of the orange box right now? And overflow X visible. So the visible thing is actually the default, confusingly, because when we put overflow auto, something about the word auto communicates default, even though that totally is not true. So overflow auto though is going to cause this guy to have a little scroll bar. And then if we were going to do position sticky, presumably, and let's make this guy smaller so that we can like actually see it. Yeah, there's our, well, maybe a little bigger than that. Okay, there's our position static thing. It's kind of spilling out too, but that's fine. So let's position it sticky and see what actually happens. well, we're not doing anything yet, right? Because we haven't given it coordinates. So let's give it some coordinates. And let's say like top 0, I don't know, left, or we'll do top 0, right 0. And apparently that we have to put the vendor prefix on it for it to work in Chrome even right now. And it'll likely, I mean, if it's made it this far, it's likely to make it into the spec. Oh, I see. So it actually, so it's kind of maybe for parallax stuff. Yeah, so this is, okay, so if you have like something you're scrolling down, you're scrolling, clouds are flying by, CSS animations are triggering, and there's an airplane moves left to right. Like, you could maybe have like, the tail fin of the airplane as you scroll goes up into the top right corner and becomes sticky and stays there as part of your navigation. So you could use this to help with parallax scrolling, I think. So handy trick to be aware of, but yeah, like just remember anytime you see stuff like that, check it first. And I think for this particular use case, you can accomplish the same thing with JavaScript, but this is probably a cleaner way to do it once it's got full support. Yeah, that's good to know. All right, so now I'm gonna kill this box for a sec though, just so we can see our original 3. And I want to just refresh on where we're at. So we've got a position relative box 1, this red guy here. And I'm actually going to remove its coordinates because I think in general we don't want to be doing that. So position relative is like you don't actually give it coordinates. You don't need to give it coordinates. Just like you wouldn't give something that's position static coordinates because there's no reason. It has no effect. For position relative, it does have an effect. But we don't want to write it in that way unless you're doing something that you're very, very certain about and you've done it a bunch of times, like Rachel was talking about. Because position relative is not about positioning that thing. It's about making that thing into a hook that other things can be positioned against. Cool. All right, so we have our red box is just chilling right up there, and it's got a margin top, so that's fine. We'll leave it the way it is, but we don't want to give it coordinates right now. But box 2, our absolutely position thing, has some coordinates, and we can go any direction. Right now, we're off to the right and up a little bit. And then we've got one green box, which is just a normal box, but it has some margin on it. So I'm going to remove the margin just because in reality you wouldn't really want to do that either, because that's going to be, you could, right? You absolutely could, position static. But once you, I guess for the purpose of absolute positioning, like this blue box, we wouldn't want it to have margin at the same time as it has coordinates, right? It probably would work. You might be able to do that and it might work great, but like it's 2 different ways of doing the same thing, and why bother? So this blue box once it's positioned absolute, do yourself a favor, make it display block, right? Just clear up any confusion, unless you can't for some reason, and then it's fine. It's not as big of a deal as like the float thing. You don't want to float a display inline element. You could position absolute a display inline element. It's not that big of a deal, but just when in doubt, take everything down to first principles and just be like, fuck it, display block. This blue block is going to be display block. It's going to be position absolute. I'm going to position it relative to its nearest ancestor with position, and I'm going to fully understand how this works, kind of.
Okay.
So use inline block or block. If you use inline block, if our blue box here had variable dimensions and we want it to stretch to fit its content, then that would be a time when you could use inline block. Exactly. Like when in doubt, use display to do your positioning needs. Take care of your positioning needs whenever possible. Not to the point of like hampering yourself, but like just start that way, and then like if you can't solve it that way, think, can I solve it with floats? If you can't solve it with floats, think like, okay, can I solve it with absolute positioning? And if you can't solve it with absolute positioning, then like the only other option that's left is like flex. Really, or like a canvas, right? And the canvas thing is like if you needed to. Actually, that's not even true. There's certain things, like I remember I had this website. One of the first websites I did was this weird. There was like this weird brain thing on it, and like one of the first websites I did. What do you expect? But yeah, there's this fucking brain and like these tendrils coming out of it. It was like for a research lab. And they kind of told me, like, no one really knows what RNA folding looks like. You can do whatever you want. And so there is a way to do that without Canvas. You can use this thing called areas. where you can like cut out geometric shapes that are clickable. So that's an option. So it's not just flex, it's not just canvas. You can do areas as well. But like realistically, I don't think that we've needed any of those things. Right. So position absolute is that blue box, and we see that inside the green box position static, like basically the normal world is still the same. So like that red box there is just a normal element. It's got normal stuff going on inside of it. Our blue box that used to be normal and used to be inside of it acting all normal, we just grabbed it, ripped it out with position absolute, and now it became positioned with coordinates relative to its nearest ancestor with position. So now z-index. So let's make our green box. Our green box is actually containing our blue box right now, but it's sort of like one of those plastic bags from like the grocery store where it's just like, it's not very strong. In fact, it's not strong at all. It's just like that blue box doesn't care. That blue box does whatever it wants. This green box, I can make it tiny if I want. I can try to I can put it somewhere crazy. That's what Rachel was showing with the margin. Like I can do whatever I want to this green box, and it will not actually have an impact on the blue box because remember, the blue box is positioned relative to its nearest ancestor with position. It doesn't matter what's in between. It doesn't matter if your dad was an alcoholic because that blue box is positioned with the values of its grandmother.
And those grandmothers have strong values.
Yes. Okay, right, 25 pixels. All right, so we're just, well, that's not going to work because, tell me, guys, remind me, why won't this work?
Static.
Right, because it's position static. So you can give it coordinates all day long, but all you're doing is introducing complexity debt to your code and making yourself confused. So this green box, it is technically the parent. It might even, we could go a bazillion levels deep. We could make more box 3s. And then they would all be parents. Like your grandparent was an alcoholic too. Doesn't matter because I'm positioned relative to great-grandma. Oh, your great-grandma was an alcoholic? I don't care. I'm positioned relative to my great-great-grandma. So with that, I'm actually gonna go ahead and break that lineage. And let's say, so now we've got our position static thing, our position absolute thing. They're now siblings. So let's change our position static one though to be position absolute. Yeah, we'll make it position absolute and we won't give it any coordinates. It's like if you have a cereal box and you're cutting the fun characters out of the back, but you haven't yet removed them from the holes. Yeah. So it's been cut out, right? It has been snipped out. And if our red box didn't have fixed dimensions, let's say we didn't give it a fixed height, boom, so it's been ripped out, right? It's no longer actually inside of that box, within the normal flow of that red box. It's been ripped out. It hasn't been positioned anywhere yet, and I would actually say that this is a code smell. So not giving something that's position absolute, giving coordinates, again, Rachel, you may come out and say there's exceptions to this, but for right now, don't worry about that. Because anytime there is exceptions to this, there's always a way around it. And like even if you learn over the years like some small tricks to be able to use hacks like this, it's just you have to also build up the confidence of like, okay, let me test this in every major browser, make sure that this hack works. So I'm gonna put that aside for a second and just say that if you ever do this, you are leaving yourself in a position of possibly being confused. Anytime you use position absolute, just always give it coordinates. If we did have more content in our red box before we had assigned this thing here, then presumably if I put like over stuff, green box it's like the browser is figuring out where it would go if it hadn't been ripped out. It's sort of like in much the same way that I'm suggesting that we all think about things as like display first, then think float, then think positioning. The browser is kind of doing the same thing when it renders, it seems, right? It's like we're rendering all of the normal flow stuff, and then it's like, oh, position absolute, let me rip that out of the normal flow. And now we haven't done anything with it yet, but it's just sitting there. So we need to do something with it. So we'll give it coordinates. Okay, y'all ready for z-index? All right, so the thing about z-index, it sounds really straightforward. We already have these x and y coordinates, this top and left. I'll tone down the yelling actually. Oh, we have coordinates! All right, guys, so yeah. When you're using these coordinates, I guess we're talking kind of more about like coordinates in general. All right, so the only time that you're gonna use coordinates is when you use position absolute, position fixed, and I don't really know about position sticky because whatever, I've never done it before. Coordinates. Coordinates can either be defined with top and left, or they can be defined with top and right, or they can be defined with bottom and left, or they can be defined with bottom and right. And those are the combinations that make any sense. Does that make sense? So no left plus right at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
It might work, it might do something, but who knows?
Rip it apart or something.
Yeah, that would actually be awesome if that was the deal. Yeah, it should throw an error. Oh my god, that would be so much better.
Yeah.
It's too late for it to throw an error because there's all those websites that probably have left and right at the same time,
Oh,
and it just silently fails, right, or silently behaves.
Yep.
And one of the probably whichever one is listed last takes precedence. But yeah, so just never combine coordinates that don't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right. So then that's about coordinates. Like, so just to see that in action, if we give the box 3, bottom 0 is left, if we were to say right 0, corner, we could say like right 25 pixels. That means that it is positioned with its rightmost side, 25 pixels from the rightmost side of it. Luckily, the coordinate system, it's a little weird, but like it's actually there for your convenience. Because sometimes it's a lot easier to be like, oh, bottom 25, like because you can't get the dimensions of this, especially for stuff that might have variable dimensions.
Yeah.
Like you don't actually know at coding time what the dimensions of something might be. So being able to position relative to the bottom of that thing or to the right of that thing can be really useful. Okie dokie. So now let's see what happens when we let things overlap. We've talked about kind of our x coordinate. We've talked about our y coordinate with with top, bottom, left, right. But there's also this concept of a z coordinate, which is just if we were in Photoshop and we had layers, like one thing might be on top of another thing, or if we're like in Google Drawings or we're in any vector art software, or
it's just a third dimension.
It's just a third dimension. It's just like right-clicking send to back, right, or send to front, bring forward, send backwards, or whatever. That's exactly what it's doing, and unfortunately, it doesn't. It's kind of overcomplicated. So here we go. Our green box. Let's bring it back to the top and get some overlap going. I'm gonna say top 0, right 25, and so you can see that it's actually underneath our blue box right now. Verify that by peeking its head out from the left. There it is. Okay. Awesome. So if we wanted it to be on top, we can use this thing called z-index. And so let's just give it like z-index 9999999. Okay. And it's on top. Unfortunately, this is where most people's knowledge of z-index ends, which despite like the problems of making this be such a huge number, which is like, imagine the next time someone's maintaining this code and like, oh, now our modal actually has another kind of overlay on top of the modal. Or if you're taking over a code from somebody else, like, what's the maximum z-index anywhere in here? Let's search and find out. So I believe that by default, z-index is either 0 or 1. The reality is like, just, I would never use z-index 0, again, unless you just really, really know what you're doing and you've tested it in every major browser, etc. But like, I think, so if you just need, so for instance, to make this box show up on top, I could have just done z-index 1, and that would have been enough. The blue box has no z-index, the green box does have a z-index. They are siblings. Blue box is green box, they're siblings. Because actually, so the z-index value is auto by default, which corresponds to 0, kind of, probably. But yeah, I would think about it, because it's not 0, I wouldn't think about it necessarily being exactly the same thing as z-index 0.
Yeah.
I just would avoid using z-index 0. But it doesn't. If it doesn't have z-index, it's like, then it's much in the same way that like if you have a tie in specificity with your CSS selectors, whichever one comes last is going to take precedence. So another thing you have to be aware of with z-index is that you can expect z-index to not work the way you think, probably. Like just now it worked great for us, but it doesn't quite work the way you think. First of all, only works on elements with position, i.e. not position static. Should you use it on relative position elements? Rachel, I know you might come out and say something, but no, like for now, don't do that. Just don't use it. Only use it on position absolute elements and position fixed elements.
And it doesn't work on position static because z is just another coordinate, and coordinates don't work on static.
Yeah, like it is that. It's like, it is different than top and left because it has a different set of rules. If I have two different blocks on the page and I position them at the same x coordinate relative to their relatively positioned ancestor, then it'll still work right and they'll go to the place I'm expecting. But with z-index, it matters whether you're siblings. So we put our green box on top with z-index, and that worked great. Now let's change where our green box is. So let's say that we're going to have another div. We'll call this box 6. And this box 6 is actually going to contain our box 3 now. So first of all, let's just make it position, it's position static. So it's down there kind of at the bottom. Let's put our overstuffings below it. So just to recap, blue box is the child of red box. So red box is the outermost container, and then the blue box and our lemon chiffon box are siblings. Our green box, which is box 3, is inside of our lemon chiffon box. So the lemon chiffon is static. And so like box 3 has a z-index set. Let's try removing its z-index. And then, okay, so we're seeing the same behavior as before. I'm gonna change it back, and we'll just see the green box is still coming through. So far, so good, right? But if I was writing this in code, I've already kind of made a fundamental confusing choice, because I've assigned z-index to something that is deep inside. Like, so what would I even be trying to do, right? I know we're pretty disconnected from like a real use case right now, but like if I wanted to position that green box absolutely relative to its lemon chiffon parent, then I would of course have given the parent position relative. The fact that I'm absolutely positioning my grandchild relative to me, the grandparent, but like that's kind of weird. Like you're going to be a lot better off if you don't ever do that, and you always position things relative to their direct parent. If only because you avoid this whole like having to remember how all this works. It's important to know how it works in your head, but like you don't want to have to like every time you're going in to change the code or look at the code, like you don't want to be having to remember it all. It's more like this theory is a way to guide you to set up a path for yourself that's going to make it as easy as possible for you to make changes and continue developing on it. So to that point, just to add another little like principle to our stuff here, whenever you do position absolute, don't position relative to grandma. Or other ancestor. Instead, use its parent. Kind of why I'm in a confusing situation already right now, and so I'm actually going to pull out before I go any further with that. Let's just say, we don't need to understand how the DOM is going to behave in this situation, because we don't want our code to even be this way, right? Like we want to avoid this altogether. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and take our lemon chiffon box, which is box 6, and I'm going to give it relative position so that it is now what our green box is inside of. So now it is stapled to the lemon chiffon box. And we have z-index on it, but we wouldn't have had to put z-index on it, or we would have. Okay, we would have had to put z-index on it, and the fact that it has z-index on it technically works right now, because the lemon chiffon box does not have z-index, and the blue box does not have z-index. So since our grandson, the little green box, has z-index, it'll win. But we're getting really far afield into having to like reason about which one shows up on top. So like we don't want to get here. Like if we see this problem, we don't want to solve it by putting a z-index on the grandbaby. We want to solve it by putting a z-index on the lemon chiffon box. So I'm going to assign z-index to it, because when I said z-index here, like only use it on at position absolute and position fixed elements. It's like only use it on position absolute and position fixed elements, or when you're like working with position absolute siblings. And that's what's going on here, because so if I give box 6 or lemon chiffon box z-index, now the lemon chiffon thing is on top. Now if I'm like, oh, but I really wanted the situation that was there before, I really want it to go like green at the top, then blue, then lemon chiffon, then red, that's fine. Then that means we need to put the blue box inside of the lemon chiffon box. Let's not make it really fucking confusing, right?
That makes sense.
So now let's run with that and say, like, let's say we ended up here, and I can't possibly think of like all of the times that you may or may not end up in similar situations to this where things are overlapping. When you do end up there, what's important to remember about z-index is that like it'll seem like it works most of the time, But it only really works when the thing that you're positioning, that you're z-indexing relative to its siblings. Okay, so like if I take this blue box and I'm like, let's take the blue box and let's actually put it inside of the lemon chiffon box. Now we're back where we were before, and now if I give the green box the z-index of 1, it's on top, and now this is good. Like this is now, okay, the lemon chiffon box contains those things, and like they're spilling out, but like maybe that's what we want because we would like to have a cool style, whatever, right? And then we're all good. It makes more sense. Now, if we were like in the position that we had before, I'm going to take the blue box back out. I'm going to go ahead and remove z-index from everything for a second, just so we don't get confused. Okay, so now lemon chiffon has green child here, and then the red box has lemon chiffon and blue. But if we want that green box to be on top, and we didn't do the thing that we just did, where we changed the structure of the HTML to make it more friendly for us and easier to maintain. If we are in this position where we can't do that, or for whatever reason we're here, and we're like, man, I just really want that green box to be right up on top there, right? We already saw that we can assign z-index to green box and it'll seem like it works. Let's though make it so that, let's assume that the blue box actually did have a z-index. Let's say that it had the z-index of 1. Okay, so the same behavior, same situation we were in before, but now that it has a z-index, let's go over to the green box and let's say, oh, okay, I want to give it z-index 2. Basically, like, if it matters what the z-index of the sibling is that your z-index, where you have the other z-index you're comparing with. So like in this case, if the blue box has a z-index and then the yellow box has a z-index, then z-index of the yellow box is what actually matters for where the green box is. It's almost like the tens place. Like it's sort of like your parent is like the tens, and your grandparent is like the hundreds place, and your great-grandparent is like the thousands place. And so like it matters a lot what the z-index of your parent is, a lot more than it matters what your z-index is. And not even like a lot more, sometimes like, you know, disqualifyingly more it matters. Basically, it's like the browser will still try to help you, kind of. Like it knows that like, okay, so like you have z-index 1 on the blue box, but the green box has z-index 2. So like we're gonna like tolerate it. But this lemon chiffon box, we're only tolerating it because the lemon chiffon box has like no z-index. If I gave the lemon chiffon box, there we go. So lemon chiffon has z-index 1. Blue box has z-index 2. Green box has z-index 2. Let's give it z-index 1000. Surely that would work, right? No, it doesn't. And the reason why is because the lemon chiffon box z-index is 1, but the blue box is 2. And they're siblings, and that's what matters. Green box is z-index 1000, but that only really matters if there's other things that have z-index that are lower that are its siblings. Z-index auto just behaves like 0, maybe. Where I would suggest it probably doesn't behave like 0 is, you know how a second ago it was like, I went in and like there was no z-index on lemon chiffon whatsoever? Because it's auto, it's like, it's allowing this z-index to still cut through. But again, I just wouldn't rely on that to work. Like it might work for you, like if, you know, in a pinch, like if you're ever just like being tortured and you have to launch something and there's no one's gonna, yeah, okay, whatever. But like, when you're in there, just know that like if I'm fucking with z-index, I need to make sure that my z-index is going to be like, I'm always going to be thinking about like what's my sibling, and I'm going to be z-indexing relative to my sibling. Otherwise, you'll be in like, you'll build like this entire platform, and there'll be like a bunch of modals and different things, and then like won't be long before you're just like, what is going on? Like, I have no idea why this isn't showing on top. If you only remember one thing, remember that z-index is kind of crafty and like. And like, just be careful with z-index, because you never know what confusions you will cause yourself. So if you, remember that first and foremost, that if you're going to use z-index, tread lightly, and then just like take it back to first principles and be like, okay, what am I doing with the z-index? I'm trying to position this, or I'm trying to put this thing on forward or in back of its neighbors. If I'm trying to do anything else with it, I'm kind of abusing z-index, and it might work for now, but I'm actually going to cause problems down the road. So today we've covered positioning, we've covered position fix, like positioning relative to the viewport, aka the window, positioning, you know, relative to like the picture frame that you're holding in front of the mural, where the frame is the window / viewport and the mural is the document, the meat of the DOM, the body, right, the HTML on the body. And then we've talked about like position absolute, which is a way for you to be in that mural and just like snip out, kind of snip out an area of it, and rip it out of the normal flow, and then use coordinates to position it either relative to the entire mural, to the entire body in HTML, or relative to some relatively or absolutely or fixed position ancestor. Some ancestor that has position that's not static. We also touched on there's a new thing called position sticky that seems like it might have some possibilities like related to parallax scrolling and possibly some other rarer use cases with scrollable areas, but it's not supported on IE 11 yet, and we still support a lot of things that need to be doing that. So I would say not quite yet, but keep it in mind if you're ever like, oh man, I'm making this rocket ship and I need the rocket ship to like stay in the top right corner. We talked about coordinates. We talked about top, right, left, and bottom. We talked about what coordinates make sense together. And we talked about what coordinates would never make sense to put together at the same time. Taking it back to position absolute for a second, whenever you're using one of your hooks to position the element with these x and y coordinates, just remember that that is ripping it out of the normal flow. And so the parent, much like when we floated elements, the parent is going to lose its height because it's not in the normal flow anymore. You're positioning it with x and y coordinates. And then you don't really want to like position an absolutely positioned element relative to anything other than its parent, unless you're positioning, even the body. Like we talked about how it looks for the nearest relatively, or it looks for the nearest ancestor with position, but it shouldn't have to. Like you don't want it to have to look. You want it to be able to just like, let's just go to mom and dad, or well, mom. So because otherwise, you're creating, much like with the z-index, like you're creating something that's hard to wrap your head around, and it's going to be easy to forget and get lost later. If you're going to use position absolute, make it absolutely positioned relative to its parent. If you want something positioned relative to the window, the viewport, use position fixed for it. And I would even argue that if you're doing position fixed, it'll work even if it's deeply nested inside of something else. It'll still be positioned relative to the viewport, but like much for the same reasons, like, no, rip that sucker out and put it on the top level, because like the less complications you got there, the better. There may be exceptions to these rules again, but like, start from there. Awesome. And then I'll wrap it with last but not least with z-index. Can't remember anything else, just remember it might not work the way you think. Be careful. And then the important thing to remember is you use it with elements that have position, and you use it to put things like send forward or send backwards, send to front, send to back, but only compared to its siblings. So it might work, it might look like it works, and it might work great for a long time if you position, or if you z-index things relative to aunts and uncles and all sorts of distant relatives, but it's best to keep the z-index with your immediate family. And then in the event of a tie, the z-index of your parent will win over your own z-index. Like it'll win because it's being compared to the z-index of its siblings. It's not being really compared to your z-index. Like much in the same way, like if your grandma likes you a lot, like she's still judging you in the context of how much she likes your mother. Can I center a position absolute element within its parent? Sure, if you know its width and height, and you know its parent's width and height, because then you can and you're okay with hard coding all those things, all that stuff. Right? If you want it to be centered, that's another reason why I don't start with position absolute. Ever. Start with use the normal flow, use the browser like it's intended, like a janky ass Microsoft Word document, and then start, as you need to do things, you're like, this is piece, just much like you're in Microsoft Word, you're like insert clip art, like insert like float clip art, like start trying to do that shit first, and then if that fails, then be like, okay, I'll make it so that I can like right click the image and be like rip out of document, and like I'll absolutely position it and I'll put it like right there. And I know that if I go type some more text earlier in my document, it's not going to look right anymore and stuff. But so yeah, position absolute is like your last resort, and it breaks any hopes you have of centering something or whatever. If you need to center something, use the other tools. And also something to consider is like a lot of times you'll find yourself stumped, or at least I know that I do. And you'll be like, man, how do I solve this like layout or positioning dimensional problem? Dimensional problems usually, and then I'll be like, oh, you know what? I just need to like put a div, one extra layer of div, right? And I'm sure I can tell Rachel's probably thinking like, don't do it too much, because you can go too far that way. But if you're really stumped, just remember that is something in your toolbox. Like you can just add another div. A lot of times, especially with centering and absolute positioning, that ends up being the solution. It's like, oh, okay, you can't like, or much like when we floated those elements, like, oh, you have 3 floated boxes, and we want to center those 3 floated boxes on the screen. We can't do that with float, but really just like put them inside of another box and center that box.
Oh, okay.
And then, you do have to, there are some restrictions, like you would have to know the width and stuff.
Yeah.
But you kind of got to look at like, okay, like what am I trying to achieve? Can I do it with normal flow and display? Can I do it with float? And worst comes to worst, can I do it with absolute positioning? And if I hit a problem and I'm like, crap, now I've gone absolute positioning and I can't like pull back out of it, you can ask yourself, okay, like, can I use another div or another container to solve this problem? And just remember, if you're gonna put position absolute, always put coordinates. If you're gonna put a top, always put a left or a right. Don't just put right. Don't just put bottom. For the same reason. Because then you're coming back to that code later and you're like, man, what is going on like with this thing? I used position absolute here, but like I never set which. Like, why is it where it is, right? You always need an X and a Y. Doing just a Y might work for a while, but like it's much less predictable, and like, and they won't change it because they can't break browser compatibility. But again, if you're using one of those kind of like something off the beaten path a little bit, you're more likely to get hit by like, maybe you were relying on vendor-specific behavior of the browser without really realizing it.
Yeah.
And then lo and behold, a Chrome update comes out and it breaks your app. So you don't want to be in that situation. Cool. This is my favorite one. This is like probably the most powerful lesson out of all the position and layout stuff. So I hope you guys got a lot out of it, and I'll see you next time.